Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to a special Tualatin City Council work session. I'll go ahead and call the work session into, uh, I'm spacing out here, into session. Tonight, we're talking about Thorn Run. Thorn Run has been selected as our team that's going to help us with lobbying both in Salem and Washington, D.C. So we'll have a discussion about the legislative process tonight and the kind of things we're looking forward to working with Thorn Run, both in DC and in Salem. I think Salem's going to be a much bigger priority with the legislative session coming on here very, very soon, so we can get our ducks in a row. But we always have to pay attention to what's going on at the federal level, especially when it comes to money and availability of grants and earmarks and stuff like that. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn this over to Megan or Dan.
I'll start us off before passing it over. So good evening, Mayor and members of the City Council. Thanks for joining me on this special work session night. You all know this, but for the record, I'm Megan George, the city's Deputy City Manager, and I'm joined with Cody Field, our Management Analyst from Community Development, as well as Dan Bates and Leah Navarro from Thorn Run Partners. I will ask them to give a bit more of a robust introduction in a few, but figured I'd kick us off. So in the meantime, a refresher on what has happened thus far. In February, we issued a request for proposals for government affairs and lobbying services, and we reviewed proposals in March and April and interviewed firms. Mayor Bubenik and Councilor Sacco were participants in that process. And then in May, the City Council authorized the city manager to execute the contract with Thorn Run. So since all of that process has occurred, Thorn Run's team has been meeting with city staff to educate us on the legislative process and orient us to how different things work. And then we've had a series of deep dive meetings with city staff so that they can learn more about the organization and the community and start talking about themes and priorities for Tualatin's legislative agenda. So tonight's meeting is a continuation of those conversations, with the objective being to get direction from the city council on Tualatin's legislative agenda. So, hey, Nicole, you might need to click. Oh, Sherilyn. Okay. Well, so far so good. So the agenda for tonight, we've scheduled about 2 hours if we need them for the meeting. And as you can see, we set the room up in a different fashion. And our thought was that it might provide an opportunity for better dialogue between counselors and between counselors and the team here tonight. Once I finish running through the agenda, I'll pass it over to Dan and Leah. And then the three of us will be kind of sharing presentation responsibility. Our plan is to give somewhat high-level overview of these topics listed there and then provide ample time for discussion and questions. For each of the agenda topics, we'll provide a short presentation or introduction, and then we'll pause for questions and/or discussions before moving on to the next item. So the order of things is for Thorn Run's team to introduce themselves in more detail and then provide an overview of the legislative process at both the state and the federal level. Again, thinking at that high-level overview. And then I'll take it over to talk about some of the themes that we gleaned from conversations with staff. And then back to Thorn Run to talk about emerging issue prioritization and just feedback from the city council on how to sift through all of the incoming information. And then we'll talk about capital projects, the money piece that the mayor alluded to earlier. And then we'll finish it up with communication and engagement protocols. So that's my plan, at least for now. We'll see where we go. All right, turning it over to you, Dan. Oh, go ahead, Sharon. Oh, it is working now.
Great.
There you go.
Thanks, Megan. Mayor, City Council, is great to be here in person, and we find it an honor to be able to do the work with you all and look forward to the coming year and years as we represent you both in Salem and in Washington, D.C. I thought I'd give a brief introduction to Thorn Run Partners, talk a little bit about our team, and then I'll have Leah also introduce herself real briefly in that context, and then we can get into a little bit of the substance. A big picture, Thorn Run Partners is a bipartisan government affairs firm based in Washington, D.C., although we have been Oregonian from the start in that I opened our presence here in Oregon in April of 2010. I had was originally working with my partners, Andy Rosenberg and Chris Lamont, thinking about the firm. They opened in Washington DC in January. I was at the time with the city of Portland, didn't want to leave the city in a lurch. And so I went through a short session and we opened up Oregon office then. And so from the get-go, we've really been about two places, which is Washington, DC and in Oregon. And so it's a great honor to represent Oregon entities in Washington, DC, but also to work at the state legislature on behalf of a number of clients. We also do work around the state. We have grown now a firm of about 50 firm-wide. Last week, we were again announced as a sort of a top 10 firm in Washington, DC. We ended up coming in number 7 in terms of the rankings that they use. To give you a sense, the local government practice is a significant practice in our Washington, DC practice. So we represent local governments around the country in Washington, DC and represent them here. And so my history has been as one that's worked in local governments, both in local government, but then also representing local governments for decades. And so I like to say, and those of you that have been around me as we started this, local government's in our DNA. It's part of what we do. And it's the way that we think. It's the way that we represent. And for us, that's about partnership between levels of government working together for the outcomes of the communities. And so it's in that spirit that we're excited about the work with TWALT. And while we have a significantly sized firm, we do create and have created a team just for the city. That team includes myself. Again, my history, I started working in Washington, DC, doing work on the Hill with Congress and representing many local governments there. Came back, which is home for me. I grew up in Canby, but came back, worked with the city of Portland for a number of years, representing the city at the state and the federal level. And then we opened up Thorn Run Partners a number of years ago. And so for me, local government's really important. The other member of the team that will be doing Washington, DC work, some of you have had the opportunity to meet, is Greg Burns. He's a co-chair of our local national local government practice. Was just out, I think, this past week, getting to know the community, visiting. It is hard when you're in Washington, DC, not from the communities, to be able to give the flavor and the tenor of the community. So Greg likes to make sure that he is here and engages in it. And then we have the resources of the Washington, DC local government practice. In Oregon, I'll be joined in our work at the state level by Tyler Jansen, who would have been here, but had his second child. His wife had their second child last week. And so we decided it would be better for him to be at home in that setting than here tonight. But Tyler also has local government, his DNA, worked for 2 different members in the legislature, and then represented the Association of Counties before he joined us in the last couple of years. Does a lot of work in our with our local governments here in Oregon. He will be leading the charge with me in Salem. Greg and I will be focused in Washington, DC. And then Leah Navarro, I'll let Leah introduce herself real quickly, will also be on the local government team for the city in Salem.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Oh, it's a little close. My name is Leah Navarro, and I'm a senior legislative associate at Thorn Run Partners. Over the past 2.5 years at the firm, I've gained a great understanding of the legislative process and have had an understanding of the pressing issues that our state faces. I've also cultivated strong relationships with elected officials and staff and various advocates. Recently, I've focused on infrastructure policy, so really delving into transportation and advocating for capital construction projects. So really excited to be here and work with you all, and hopefully we can take advantage of some of the opportunities that we have to improve our community.
That's Thorn Run Partners in a nutshell. We're happy to sort of spend a lot of time talking about us, but it's probably better to get on to the legislative process. I don't know if you have any questions around who we are and what we do, but if not, I'll jump into sort of a broad overview. Great. On the legislative process, one of the things that you've done that is extraordinarily valuable as you've decided to coordinate your state and your federal legislative affairs efforts. And a lot of places wish they had done that or wish they did it. The work that you have engaged in, I think, will be very helpful in making sure that your partners, whether at the federal level or state level, know that you're working with these different processes in mind, that there are different partnerships at different level. The number of times that I'm in a meeting where I'm either at the state level or the federal level, and I'm asked, so what are the feds doing on this one? What's the state going to put in on this? What's the local community going to do? And so again, while it is easy to think in silos, and as someone that has been in and around government for a long time, it's easy for us to go there. Having a government relations program that steps back and looks at the process as a whole and how to try and meet your community needs with a strategic layering of the different partnerships that are available is the right approach. I thought I might give a bit of a sense on the timelines that you face. The mayor sort of introduced that a little bit at the beginning. It's easiest to say is that the state and federal processes are different. They're on slightly different timeframes, but they are gelled well enough together that it's important to think about them together. So I'll start at the federal level. Obviously, Congress is year-round, ongoing. They split into sessions, and then after each election, there will be a new session of Congress. Who knows what happens in November, but that obviously kicks off a 2-year cycle. And so we often think about the federal process in sessions of Congress. Within that, it's important to know that sort of policy realms, policy issues often are alive, our bill will be alive for two years, right? In the current session of Congress. When you layer on the appropriations process, which is how you seek funding, it's how the government funds itself. They do that on a fiscal year process. So there will be 2 fiscal years within each session of Congress. And we think of fiscal years as different opportunities to pursue strategic partnership with the federal government on appropriations or on funding. And so there's essentially within each Congress 2 bites at the apple, as it were. Those fiscal years also then lay the groundwork for what grants might be available, because different federal agencies on an annual cycle based on what Congress does on the appropriations will then send the funds out through grant processes, which also tend to be on this annual cycle. So the Congress has both a 2-year feel to it, which you'll, if you followed Oregon politics, will feel somewhat familiar to you on the budgeting process, but they budget on an annual basis. And so that means we have this appropriations process. That typically means that on appropriations, which I'll focus a little bit on, that process often starts technically in the spring of a particular year. And in the spring of that particular late winter of the particular year, Congress will make this essentially a call for projects from different communities and organizations within a certain subset of different accounts that they've predetermined. Congress will determine which projects should be funded. That process lasts a few months, and you go through an iteration of being accepted by a committee or not, and members take requests from the communities. Those bills then ultimately get passed, hopefully in a normal process, somewhere in the summer to, it's Congress. So some 6 months after that, depending on when it is. But the process starts at the beginning of the year, and it should end in the fall, but typically ends at the end of the year. That's their technical process. And if you were successful in getting funding, you found out at the end of the year of 2024, that funding is probably likely available in the spring of 2025. To give you, so you start in the actual process in late winter of 2024, and at that point, you might see funding from that effort in the spring of the following year. Now, what we like to do and what we're encouraging the city and the team to think about is think even longer term than that. Because one of the things that you want to do is make sure that your members, their staff, stakeholders have an understanding of the projects that you're going to be pursuing. And if you have an opportunity to educate them in the months leading up to the formal process, you have a better chance of getting buy-in on that and being successful in your funding endeavor on a variety of different levels. That means you push that process out a few months prior to that so that you begin identifying what those projects you might seek funding for. Essentially, in this case, you know, for a project that you would have submitted in January or February of this year, I would have been urging you to have started that process in the fall of 2023. So here we are, looking at the fall of 2024. This agenda process is around setting up potential funding request asks that ultimately, if successful, you would submit in the spring of 2025, go through the process, end up getting funding if successful in the spring of 2026. So it's a long term, even though it's this annual process. So when you think about agenda items in the federal funding process, you have to think what project's going to be ready 18 months from now, 2 years from now. And we'll get through what makes a good project. And I think the team has heard me a little bit on probably ad nauseum around what makes a good project on this, but you do have to think in that time frame. So that's the appropriations process. We used to call them earmarks. It's now a bad word, so we don't say earmarks nearly as much, but that's what we're talking about, is when Congress steps in and designates a particular project in a particular community for funding. That's the time frame. And again, we'll have 2 of those efforts with each Congress. So that's the work that we're kicking off today, as it were, to be ready for a process that starts in January and February. Grants are released typically on a cycle that the agency is preset, and what they do, they get them ready to go, and then they wait to see what their funding levels are. And they'll see if they have instructions from the administration around what the focus will be if Congress and these appropriations bills. So when Congress passes these appropriations bills, some of the accounts, they'll designate specific projects. Other times they may just send essentially a funding level until the agency spend the funds. And sometimes they'll say, with a focus on this or with a focus on that. And so then they'll write the funding opportunities, agency write the funding opportunities with that in mind. And so while it's on a regular process, you pay attention to what Congress writes in the bills. We do. You don't have to. That's why we do this. And you also pay attention to sort of priorities within the administration that are being pushed out of these different elements. But that's a regular cycle that you get into. So that's the federal process and a sense of timeline. At the state level, as you know, we have a session every year now, and odd numbered years are long sessions and even numbered years are short sessions. And so right now we're obviously anticipating a long session that will begin in January and finish at the end of June. The first deadlines for that will be in September of this year. So that's the process starts earlier in the cycle on the state level side. And that first deadline is when members of the legislature have, it's the deadline they have to submit legislative concepts to Legislative Council for drafting. It's the beginning of the bill drafting process. And if you want your bill ready to go day one of the session, you have to hit that deadline. We'll get into the mechanics of, we don't have to, but there are mechanics about what that means if you don't hit the deadline and whatnot. But just that process begins starting, frankly, now. And I tell folks, as I've been told, apparently the sleep before midnight is the best sleep. Even if you get a lot of sleep after midnight, it's not as good as the sleep before. That's the way I talk about legislative process and preparation for this. The work that you get done early on stakeholders is the best work. And so as you work around project funding at the state level, policies, bills, the early work you do with stakeholders, colleagues to try and vet those issues so that when the first deadline happens, you're ready to go. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you're ready to go, will pay dividends when you get into session. And so the first deadline started in September. The state is on a biennial budgeting process. And so theoretically, there's one budget for the entire 2 years because Oregon goes into a session every year. There is spending that occurs in both sessions, so both sessions still produce an opportunity for funding. It is much more limited in the short sessions. So the work that you want to do is really about trying to get funded in the long session. You have to have a much different, more urgent reason to be funded in a short session. You can still do it. And there are often good reasons for it, but really you want to be ready to go. And you want to begin socializing those asks, getting them ready to go, talking to potential supporters, talking to members in the fall, the winter, before you go into a session. And so that's, again, why we're in this process. And you can see how it links up at some level with that federal timeline, where if you're doing the good work, you're vetting it in the fall and the winter of the year prior. There's an ongoing process in the legislative process that I don't think we need to spend a ton of time into about that, which I'm happy to geek out with you about legislative process. But to give you a sense, that's why what we're doing tonight, the work, the early work, and the hours that we spent on this will pay dividends long term, even though it feels like sessions months and months away. Leah's got an internal clock that's like her stress level just starts to rise as we get closer to January. And that's why we're doing this work. I'll turn over to Leah to talk a little bit about our role in the session and the way that we engage, to give you a sense of sort of how that interacts. But any questions on timeline process before I turn it over to Leah? Councilman.
I might be early here, but so I guess when you speak, could you tell us more like your role? Is your role just to help us get appropriations, or is it to help with specific legislation that affects us?
I think the answer is both. And we'll jump into that in a bit. One of the reasons that we spent the time with the city team in advance is to really hear, and I think those that we met with heard me say, what keeps you up at night? And sometimes that's policy, sometimes that's the need for funding, but then really to help prioritize an agenda which is why you have a legislative agenda, which I think we'll jump out of order and talk about that a little bit. The agenda really is your signal to the legislative body about what are the top priorities of the city in the legislative process. That doesn't mean that because something's not in the agenda, we won't be dealing with it. In fact, a lot of the issues that are really important to the city won't necessarily be on the agenda, but it's where we're putting our specific resources, both as a Thorn Run and as the city. And there's a criteria around how you look at that. You begin thinking, if we don't do it, is anyone else going to? And if the answer is no, then that rises naturally on the level of what Tualatin will be focused on. So often your funding request, if you're not asking for it, it's not going to happen. There are some big policy issues that you all care about that we spent time with the city team around, for which it is the top agenda item of some really important coalition members, the League of Cities, the Metropolitan Mayors Consortium, Association of Counties, other business organizations for which the issues you care about are the front. And so really our role is then how do we offer support either to our delegation around those issues, and those don't necessarily end up on a legislative agenda, but we will be helping you advance that and making sure that we put your effort on that. So it's both issues, both the funding side and policy issues. And the legislative agenda is the process by which we telegraph where we're putting our resources and what's important, as opposed to a litany of all the possible things that you may weigh in on. And we will help you with all of that in short answer. Lee, you want to talk a little bit about sort of what we do?
So Dan did delve into some of the talking points that I'm going to be discussing, but Thorn Run's role is to really assist the city in developing its legislative agenda through an achievable and strategic advocacy approach. And
our counselor has her hand up. Can we, Counselor Brooks, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. My question, just back to what we were just talking about. I I had a curiosity around if there is something that is something that the city is advocating for that is different than the mayors or the National League of Cities. How is that managed with us working with you?
Counselor, I suppose the way that I would start the answer on that question, which is our primary responsibility is to understand what your all's position is. And then to begin to articulate and think through what's the best way to advocate for that position. And so there's a variety of different scenarios that works itself out either in DC or in the state level. If it is a position contrary to what the prevailing organizations are doing, then you're probably going to want to have a louder voice on it if it's important to you, or to build a coalition of the opposition, as it were, where maybe you're not the loudest voice, but you're helping build a coalition and adding to it that looks different than that. And the first threshold question, of course, is how important is it to the city? There are issues for which you may have a different position, but it's not that important to you, so you may not want to use city resources on it. So there's both a prioritization and a positioning question that you ask yourself that we would then assist you in helping develop the strategy. Likewise, if there's a position for which you're consistent with one of the associations or stakeholders, then we would, again, ascertain how important is it to the city, how much resource do you want to put on it, and then help you devise a strategy about how to be a supportive of those associations, to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts, that we're not working to cross purposes, that we're in sync. And so really the first question is, what's the position? And the second question is, how important is it? And the third is, let's devise a strategy to effectively use the city's resources to advocate one way or the other.
Okay, and so then that's not a problem with, we have an independent relationship with this, your agency, as opposed to other clients of yours.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
That was my question. It just came up when you were talking to about Councilor Pratt's question. Thank you very much for taking the time.
So a little bit about Thorn Run's role. Thorn Run's role is to assist the city in developing its legislative agenda through an achievable and strategic advocacy approach, and that's usually categorized into three main buckets. The first is where Thorn Run and the city really lead on issues, which is like funding requests and any priorities that are directly relevant to the city. And then the second is how we can support other associations, groups, and advocacy groups on some of the issues that align with the city's interests. And that can look like letters of support, logos, endorsements. And then the third is really monitoring any policy developments and efforts that would be of interest to the city. So our part is to really leverage our knowledge and resources and relationships to inform the best course of action. And we do so by working with both sides of the aisle, so Democrats and Republicans, by engaging and participating in coalitions and work groups and consistently interacting with elected officials, staff, and agencies. Most importantly, we have regular presence at the Capitol during interim committee legislative days and during legislative sessions to meet client deliverables and deadlines. So our team is there before the first committee until the last committee of the day. And that's really to ensure that we're not only recognizable, but also accessible to legislators and others in the building. And it provides a great opportunity for us to schedule meetings and attend meetings with clients to ensure that there's a seamless and effective interaction between the office and the client.
So in short, we'll be walking with you from the very beginning to the very end, and we'll do everything from scheduling to actual lobbying. We communicate, Leah and Tyler on the state stuff will be in contact with Megan and Cody, if not hourly, close to occasionally when things get really busy. And then we have a formal process by which we send reports to the city, updates moving forward. There are times that we will ask, and we'll spend a little bit of time on this, that we may ask you all to be the voice, the lobbyist, as it were, in that role. We also recognize that's our job. And so we won't ask for you to do that unless we think it's a critical moment where the presence as an elected official is what needs to happen in that meeting. And so we make that judgment call based on our own relationships with those folks, as well as the where we are in the process. And so it's this essentially organic process on legislative endeavors where we're doing soup to nuts with regard to you on the advocacy, both at the state level and at the federal level in that regard. So that's our role, which is really to be your advocate in those two places, knowing that you can't be there. There are times that we will call you to be there, but that's a secondary endeavor, but sometimes the most important endeavor. So with that, I think unless there are questions around our role and the legislative process, we can do a legislative process 201 at another time if you want it. I'm happy to also do that separately. But
Were there any questions or additional comments? Okay, I'll keep going. So I mentioned this at the start, but we held a series of deep dive meetings with staff that work on legislative and policy issues, as well as our executive leadership team. And the goal of these meetings was for Thornrun's team to get to know the organization a little bit better, to know the community. And so staff summarized previous advocacy work that city staff and members of the city council have conducted in the last few years. Impacts of legislative changes on how they've impacted the community and the organization both. Themes that are on our radar because they show up in the council's vision or list of priorities for 2024, or they are pieces of direction that the council has provided in the last year or so. Thornrun's team has taken a look at our graphics from the advance this last year, including the vision and the priorities. So through those conversations, we identified a list of themes. The themes I imagine will look pretty familiar. They're pretty high level. Of course, every list from Tualatin starts with transportation. These are in no particular order, however. So these are things that came up through those conversations that we think there has been issues that have been relevant to us, or we think there will be issues relevant to us. We won't necessarily have an ask for every single one of these items. In fact, we don't on our draft so far, but these are the types of things that felt salient for this community and this organization. So starting with transportation, of course, things like ODOT's funding, public transit in the area, regional transportation projects, excuse me, transportation projects in Tualatin, protecting the 50-30-20 revenue formula from the state highway fund, and then any future revenue sources. So a lot of things that came up with the recent letter from Clackamas County we took a look at. So on to housing. This, of course, is included in the council's 2030 vision, as well as the list of 2024 priorities. And it kind of runs the gamut between things like increasing affordable housing options in the community and also protecting things like the city's SDCs. So lots of various impacts there related to housing. Social services. So traditionally, this has not been one of the chief focuses of city organizations. However, in the last few years, and probably further back than that, it has grown in necessity. And so under this category, we included things like the mental health resource team out of our police department, some of the homelessness issues and houselessness issues that we've addressed over the last year or so, lack of supportive services nearby and the impact on that to our community members, and kind of miscellaneous items there. Okay, resiliency and emergency preparedness. So this ties in a little bit with the next one being environment, because with the adoption of the Climate Action Plan, there were a whole list of actions related to adaptation to climate change. And so some of those actions feature here under resiliency. There's also large conversation about building a resilient water system, as was discussed as part of our water master plan adopted last year as well. Then with the environment category, like I said, the Climate Action Plan was adopted. We're still working to prioritize the actions out of the Climate Action Plan, but some of the recent initiatives we've undertaken that are relevant to this are the In-Pipe project. We're working to develop a water conservation plan, and then the council's interest in discussing the street tree program. Okay, downtown revitalization. This is another one that showed up in the council's list of 2024 priorities, specifically to communicate to the community about the progress on the urban renewal area there. But this came across in a variety of different ways, whether it's infrastructure in downtown, providing wayfinding and other options for businesses that are already located there, reimagining some of our public spaces like the Veterans Plaza and of course the other side of the Commons, the lakefront, or not, excuse me, lakefront, goodness, the riverfront property as part of our Parks and Trails bond. So a lot of activity coming up in the next few years related to downtown. Local control and unfunded mandates. So this kind of maps out onto each of the ones already listed on the screen. Some of the recent examples have been the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking that the city has participated in. Paid Leave Oregon has had a major impact on our organization, but there are many, many others, and something that certainly this community, as well as the League of Cities, are very concerned with. So the last thing on the list is capital projects, which are construction projects essentially. And we've got a few slides later on about this, since this is where we spend a lot of our time discussing and gearing up for a legislative agenda. So I won't go into detail here, but it is captured as one of the themes, and we'll get into more detail. So where we're going from here on the themes is I'm going to hand it back over to Dan and Leah to talk about how to prioritize emerging issues and these themes being part of that. But before I do that, I'll pause and see if there are any questions or comments based on what I shared. Yeah, no surprises. Okay, back to you guys.
Great. So, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I want to give you a sense of the way that we advise clients around building their agenda and what we've advised the city team around, both on policy and then also on projects. So on policy, often you start out with local governments care about virtually everything. You're a major employer. Your citizens care about virtually everything. And so they ask you to care about everything. And so whether it's employer issues or tax issues or environmental issues, I mean, you look at the list up there, and that's an extraordinarily broad agenda for someone seeking partnership at a state level. Most clients show up at a legislative body, whether DC or in Salem, and they've got one thing they care about. So local governments have the responsibility of a broad agenda, but that also then means it's incumbent on you to think a little bit more about the prioritization of the issues that you need to advance and where you want to put your resources. And so as you think about policy in particular, one of the issues you have to ask, and this is where is sort of the but-for test. And the but-for test works in different ways, but if we don't do this, will anyone else? And if it's an issue that you care deeply about, that it's a high priority, then it probably pushes you forward in advancing something and taking the lead on something. You may still go build a coalition, but you're building the coalition that you know won't get built unless you're doing it. And so there are occasional efforts that a local government may endeavor, but it's not super common. In fact, it's quite unusual in which a policy that affects local governments affects a particular community in a unique way. Sometimes it emerges that you need to go find a remedy for that or to try and get a tweak in some way. But most often the concerns that you have or the opportunities you see about policy are something that you join with other local governments, not just cities, but counties and special districts. And really the but-for test isn't met at some level about where you want to put a lot of resources. You're still going to be supportive. You're still going to be or opposed, depending on what the policy is, or collaborative in trying to make it better, or a variety of different ways in which you're going to add your insight, support. But as you ask your delegation to take care of Tualatin, you're going to let others lead in these other areas, and you're going to be supportive. Now, there are moments when in the life of a local government and its advocacy, there is a policy issue for which everyone cares about, but you need to put all of your focus on that issue. And the but-for test isn't really something that makes sense. I find that with local governments, that's relatively rare. Most of the time, the good work done by the associations with your support is the best pathway forward. So from a prioritization, I often ask that question, which is, how important is this to Tualatin? Does it affect you uniquely? And if no one else is doing it, will the advocacy occur? And that's how we judge those different pieces. On funding, I put a slightly different, obviously that but-for test is important because if it's funding that you want, maybe a community partner is going to ask for it, maybe someone else that cares about that funding the community. But if Tualatin's not asking for it, the ask is likely not going to get made in a substantial way. But you have to think about that a little bit differently as well, is because you also then have to ask, what is it that we need funding for that fits within the areas of funding that the partner may have to offer? So what if you need something funded that the state doesn't fund, obviously it's not a good ask. Likewise, at the federal level, if you need funding for something and the feds don't fund that, it's not a good ask. So you have to ask then, does it qualify for the funding? And we spend our time and efforts making sure that we know with these different funding streams and what qualifies and can give advice, do some more research, figure out a way to make it work if it's a super high priority. And then the other piece, and I think the team has heard me on this a lot, which is you have to know the timing. The worst thing you can do is go ask a lot of people to be helpful to you to get funding and not be able to spend it because it doesn't land in the right time frame of the project. You're not ready to go. You already built it and the funding comes later. All of those are bad scenarios where people won't want to help you in the future and partner because you haven't done the hard work of figuring out, does it fit on timing? The next piece, and this is a phrase that keep in mind, state funding or federal funding should be a capstone, not a cornerstone. You don't build projects starting from the ground up with state or federal funding. You have a project finance plan in which the state or the federal funding are the last dollars in or close to. And that's what your partners will want to fund because it demonstrates a level of community support and collaborative support with your partners and that you've done the hard work of making the finance plan work, that they're then helping you go the last mile on. I see too often people build aspirations of projects with a small earmark at the federal level or a state investment that ends up not turning out. And you may get the money spent, but you don't get the outcome that you're hoping for on the project because you weren't ready and the finance plan doesn't work. And while I've seen a lot of it, those that have been in elected office at the state and the federal level, particularly those funders who are within the agency, see it a lot more than I do. And so they're going to be very wary of funding where they're the first dollars in or even the middle dollars in. They want to be the capstone, not the cornerstone. So that's some of the criteria that we use around it. And then the other piece that I like to reference, and this is harder to predict, and we try and do this, but it changes over time. Each of these bodies at a particular time, there's a zeitgeist that exists around what's going to happen. And so in the next state legislative session, most of you have heard sort of a conversation around transportation. There's going to be a significant effort to have a transportation finance package or investment package in the session. There's a lot of folks then that think that this session will be about transportation. But things change, and not just they change because politics change on it. They change because events happen. If you had asked me, the level of investment in housing and water and behavioral health that occurred in this last short session have to do with the changes in the broader community that demanded certain outcomes in the legislature, and that created new opportunities. And so part of what we have spent some time talking with the city team around is being ready and flexible in case something shows up that we don't necessarily anticipate now. So we know some things we need to be ready. We need to be ready to talk about transportation. If, if there is a conversation that emerges that flips and all of a sudden you have to be ready to talk about something else, it's a lot harder if you haven't thought about it ahead of time. I'll give you, and we also begin to describe the projects that you're interested in a slightly different way based on what those themes are. There's some good examples. There were a number of water projects that were funded this last session in the name of housing production. They indeed are related to housing production. Most of those projects were thought of before housing production was going to be the big theme of the session. Local governments had done the work to be ready with certain projects that they unlocked housing, made them even more compelling this last session. So you have to think about the broader set of benefits of your project and then think about what sells in any particular session and be willing to pivot if you really, really want to talk about resiliency. But the zeitgeist is housing production. You focus on housing production. Now, what you don't do is say a project does something it doesn't do. So you don't take a project that doesn't produce housing and say it produces housing. That's not what you do. But you do consider what elements of your projects are most compelling and you advance those. This last session in House Bill 4002, which was the reforms to Measure 110 and a significant level of investments in behavioral health, there were a number of things funded that people had dreamed of for a while that were really needed, that because we had this investment package that married those two pieces together, were funded this last session. Again, they didn't think of those projects in the last second. Those were projects that they had been doing the advocacy for, that the moment then afforded them the opportunity to advance it. And so one of the things that we think about is having projects at the ready, even if they're not on the agenda, that we can then go back and pull forward and say, you're really talking about X, Y, and Z. This project that we've been working on has significant benefits there. And so part of this is being nimble over time to have a slate of things that you're ready to be ready with. So that's the way that we evaluate and would urge people to think about what should be on their agenda on those different tests. I'm going to dive real quickly just to give you a sense so that you don't have to worry about getting it all wrong. We evaluate every bill that is introduced in the session. Leah and I and Tyler at the state level and Greg and I at the federal level monitor what is happening. And at the state level, there's a really robust tracking system that we will use, and we will cull it, the ones that we think the city should care about. Not necessarily that you're going to use your resources to advance them, but you should care about it. We make sure that the team knows about them. We'll rank them on how we think the city should, and it looks something like this. A 3 is, we don't like, it affects us, but we don't really care, right? A 2 is, we may want to weigh in with a letter, join a coalition, put our logo on something, but it's not something that we're going to really use a lot of resources. And a 1 fits into that category of we're going to put substantial time in it. And I often, the way that I tell local governments, both the electeds and the staff, which is this an issue you're willing to come to Salem on? If so, it raises a level of priority that we think about in that. Now, if you really like to go to Salem, I'm going to ask you to don't use that just as a criteria. It's better for those that hate to go to Salem or hate to go to Washington, D.C. Is this one that you're willing to go for in that regard? But we go through that process. We're regularly collaborating with the other local governments, the other associations. And so we'll have a safety net of issues that you just don't need to worry about the fact that if it's not on the agenda or if we haven't talked about it, that it's been lost. Now, obviously, if it's important, raise the issue. We want to have that dialogue, but we do have a safety net of making sure that we're monitoring for the city a wide swath of bills, hopefully most of which you won't have to deal with. So that's sort of how I would look at prioritization.
Yeah, so that brings us to our first discussion item, which is getting feedback from you all on what you would like to prioritize. Somewhat thinking in that lens of what's a 3, what's a 2, what's a 1. And we can use the themes as a starting point for discussion, but feel free to chime in with anything that rises to the top for you. What we're looking for from this discussion, and we don't have a lot of structure for how we want this discussion to go. We figured it could be pretty free flowing, but what we're looking for feedback on at this point is what is at the top of the list for Tualatin? What are the types of things that we need to rank a 1 and start paying attention to and be really active on? And between multiple items, what is more important than not? So I'll pause there, turn it over to you, Mayor, if that's okay, for feedback from council.
Right? So anyone want to start?
I'll start with the transportation.
What a surprise.
There's a multitude there. I think, well, I don't know, like the efficiency of the funding sources that they come up with is important to us, even though I guess that's not our direct call, but, and then that split, our 20% split that we get on the gas tax from new funding sources is a huge one to me. My other big concern is that, Sherwood's growing. Sherwood wants to expand their urban growth boundary hugely towards Newburgh, and 99 is terrible. And all that traffic flows through Tualatin because we're the access to the freeway. So that's, I think, the big transportation one for me. And hopefully we're not revisiting tolling in its former form, but that would be one if that is the case.
I'd add to that, you know, we're the League of Oregon Cities, MMC are all gonna be all over any kind of transportation package, but what they might not be on is, as Council President Pratt said, is 99W itself. In the 5 cities, starting with Sherwood going up to Tigard, that it runs through, there was support for a study on it that got through the legislature. But then when it came to do some work on it, that's when the legislature walked out, and 99W hasn't been looked at again. That's something I'd like to see some special attention paid to. When we went to Salem, I don't remember how many years ago, before COVID, you know, legislature was on board, but it's been forgotten about. And we got to deal with 99W. You know, it's a major transportation route between Yamhill County and into Portland, and it impacts, you know, all of our cities differently. But that's one of the things that specifically to our little region here, other than the state, that, you know, I'd like to see a little attention paid to. Maria, how you had your hand out?
Yeah. Oh, well, I didn't have my hand up, but Councilor Brooks said, let's not
Okay.
forget about her. Transportation, definitely. I think that that's number one thing. I ditto everything they say, just the expansions around our community, and we're basically an exit. I mean, we're right there where most people who want to go towards Sherwood, Newburgh, all that area, definitely impacts us a lot. So yeah, that's one. I mean, we can go on and discuss other things.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Housing, definitely another thing that I feel impacts. And I think it's not so much, it's just, for me, what I see is that if we are going to have transportation and issues, housing also is another, because people need to live somewhere. So that's the other thing that I see as a top priority, in my opinion. And I know this might sound a little funny, but my other priority will be downtown revitalization, because of, like I said, I'm thinking of Tualatin. So those kind of like what I see as my 3 priorities.
I'm going to riff on this one too. So we've always talked about it's not particularly the SDC fees, it's just the cost of infrastructure. And the state has never come forward. They want us to build all this housing, but they won't come forward with like zero interest loans or any kind of mechanism to help us pay for this infrastructure. We all know sure wants to grow like crazy, but what's holding them back is the cost of infrastructure. We've got, the third rail of Tualatin politics, Stafford Triangle. What's holding that back is, the cost of developing that land. So if the state wants to, help us build, more affordable housing, they got to help us with infrastructure. They got to help us with, first time home buyer kind of loans, all the things we all know about. But they seem to forget that they're just gonna make an edict and say, hey, you got to increase your housing production by 30%, report back on how you do it. It all comes down to funding and mechanisms, assistance from DLCD on how to do this stuff. So part of that, the two things, Maria was talking about, is getting back to the nuts and bolts of it. We can have the aspiration, but not having the mechanisms. If they don't supply us with the mechanisms, we're not going to hit the goals. And we're a small community. We're not the size of Hillsborough and stuff. We can come up with, maybe pots of money out of their urban renewal zones to help with it, but that's, super important.
And if I chime in, and add that even if we have land to,
Mhm.
it still is at a pricing that is not affordable. So that's also, yeah, they want us to expand and create and build housing, but it's also, if we do that, it's still not at that affordable for a first time home buyer, small families, and, so yeah, I share the same idea.
Council Brooks has her hand up.
Thank you, Mayor. The way that I'm thinking through, I appreciate the presentation. First of all, thank you for the information and for your work. And I'm looking forward to working together. With some of the conversation that we've done so far, part of where my thoughts go have to do with what I've learned about, I think part of the reason why I wanted to have a lobbying firm was to help with capacity building for our city. So for me, it's dollars. And I guess for myself, I appreciate like the idea of not doing grant chasing. And I do think that a city is like a grassroots organization, so that as we move forward with our policy ideas and our planning, that we want to strategically get the best that we can in where we're at. So when I go to what we're doing with the parks, for instance, right now we're spending out our parks bond money. So we have a foundation there for matching, so that anything that we could do from state or federal dollars, we have an interest in being more resilient and climate and, and moving into a new time as a city with our revitalization downtown and with our parks and with the building. So I also think like our climate action plan is something that's a useful tool to help with however the legislature comes down on things. So I kind of look at it more like that with the, I think water is really important. Roads are really important. How we're going to reduce carbon is really important, effectively. And, and then of course, just the basics, what people need, safety, and what makes communities healthy. But I don't know if it's like, this is this particular list. For me, it's our policy priorities are listed and where we've gone to work on. And so it's how do we you know, best leverage what's happening and stay in touch with what's happening that fits well with what we're doing. And then the other thing, just nationally, with the work that's going on to simplify the grants process for applications for cities, and just being strong on those kinds of efforts so that these kinds of opportunities are efficient and effective for our city to be able to utilize. I don't see us as exactly being in charge of coalitions either for advocacy, but I do think that a little extra, like with community development block grants, for instance, such little amounts of money that come to communities, and that we should always be pushing for more of current funding streams that help people that fit into these priorities that we have. So I'm sorry it's not as specific as the question, but I hope it's helpful.
Councilor Sacco.
Thank you. I don't have a whole lot to say that hasn't already been said, but just looking at this list, I can't think of one thing that goes above transportation. So I'll just echo that. It's hard to say that, one thing's more important than another up here too, because they're all very important in their own right. But I would probably then put housing as a close second. But I'm really interested in finding opportunities that we could leverage what's already on the table that fits into these themes.
Councilor Hilliard.
Thank you. I would agree that transportation and housing are the top. But as I think about the words that you said about having that secondary package ready and really understanding the landscape of what could be out there and what direction the wind might blow, to understand, I feel like housing, downtown revitalization, environment, social services, and transportation are really kind of intertwined in a lot of ways. And so I feel it's really important that we make sure that as we're looking at our primary, secondary, and tertiary, packages, that we're going to be ready to go. In my mind, that's what we're building, right? That we ensure that we could take that message and move it, not to have a different outcome, right? I totally respect, and that's how we all want to work, right? To build respect and trust of our partners in our community, including from our residents, right? And so I feel like it's really, really important that we put those things that are naturally together in packages and be able to move them forward. Because I'm very familiar with that 110 work that happened, and I know that was 2 years in the making ahead. And so what you've said really resonates, and I'm really excited about how we could intertwine some of these things and make sure that as our area grows, that we're best serving our residents. Thank you.
Other comments? President Pratt.
I don't know if this falls under social services, but I know one thing we've advocated for, and I found out a lot about what a big issue this is lately, is the cost of childcare and getting, so if that's something that came up in legislature, I certainly think that's something we'd want to advocate for.
Councilor Reyes.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone. I think if we also use like Councilor Herrera was saying, the holistic approach, which one topic, but then everything also encompasses in that whole that big thing. So if it's going to be transportation, definitely impacts environment, housing, social, all that. So I think that we can do all. Not all, but in a holistic way, and put in a priority. Okay, I'm gonna housing, but also it's transportation, also it's social services, like having agencies that can provide maybe support for housing, or so everything sort of is holistic in my opinion, just depending on what the main thing. So as you're doing your second plan B, plan C, and all that, I think that's where we can still get maybe a smaller percentage of everything, but whatever the main thing, we can all benefit from all those things that are out there.
All right, my comments. I've just got a couple. What I would appreciate is when we're trying to achieve some of these items is your oversight on when you were saying, Dan, about being the capstone, not the cornerstone, and how we can assemble those packages of federal, state, city money, maybe even metro money. Because that's one of the things I think we don't have capacity for. But if you know how to put those jigsaw puzzles together, that would be greatly appreciated. And question on the federal level, isn't there also like every once in a while, congressional member can do a special appropriation for a specific, I'm thinking Sherwood Beaverton gets them all the time. That's outside it's not a grant and it's not earmark, but they do a special appropriation because somehow they really get money for a specific project.
Mayor, I actually think those are one and the same. I think what you hear about Beaverton and those are, we now call them congressionally directed spending
Right.
projects, CDSs, which are earmarks. So there are some, I'll give you, so there's the annual appropriations
Mhm.
process. What you may be thinking about, which is there are some other bills that can produce essentially project funding that are named. The transportation bill is the best example of that. And the nice thing about the transportation bill, assuming that we're about halfway through the bipartisan infrastructure law, so the process is starting now in DC to think about the next one, which is that's self-appropriating. So you don't actually then have to take that project and go back through the appropriations process. And so you'll get some, you can get essentially project funding that way that sits outside of the appropriations process. There's also another bill, two others. One may apply to you based on where you are in our conversations, probably not this next iteration, but potentially the next one is the Water Resources Development Act, which may pass this year, where you can get authorization to ask the Corps of Engineers to be involved in some restoration projects or other types of water projects. When you get named in that, you still have to go back through the appropriations process and get named again. It's just a little bit easier. And that happens every 4 to 6 years. So that's a potential one. And then something like the FAA bill will often have some specific funding in it, that if you had an airport, you might be able to. So there are some special bills that come around, but even like the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a lot of spending in it, didn't really designate projects in it. That's really it really is the province of the appropriations process. Sometimes it's rare. You can approach an agency with a project that you want to get funded. It won't be written in a bill, but if ultimately you're successful with the effort, they may find within their discretionary dollars some level of investment there. It is typically done in the context of a grant that they issue, for which they've helped draft a grant for those types of projects, as opposed to yours specifically. That tends not to be the way they operate.
Okay. And then gotta figure out how to say this the right way. So we have a specific issue here in town with gunshot noise. And we have our representatives are reluctant to talk about it. And it's kind of a frustration. So we might take this offline, we've got multiple cities, you're talking about a city coalition that are interested in discussing this. But the representative or representatives and our senator aren't interested or want to keep arm's distance. And that's something I'd like to chat with you, not here, how we can address, because it's not going away. People are more irritated about it. And it's something we should be able to work out. But it's infuriating to me that I'm making all these phone calls and I'm having to do all this stuff, and you just get rebuffed or told straight out, I'm not touching this. So
Happy to have that conversation.
Okay. Council Brooks. Got dark there. What happened?
Well, I forget which way it goes now. It's a little bit later here. Yeah, so when we were talking to, one of the things that crosses my mind, and it kind of blends into what the mayor was talking about, but we have really clear understanding that, there's operations and then there's policy. And then we as policymakers, we are, at least for me, I'm very interested in information. So I think that also one of the priorities for me is education around things that are happening and how conversations are going at a policy level so that we can have conversations and discussions. I'm interested in facts. I feel like there's a lot of opinion making lately, and I am a scientist, so I like to know, what's happening without the pitch, just the facts. I don't mind a pitch, but there's a lot of it going on. And I think that it's a really great opportunity to work with you, your firm, and help us be good policymakers. Especially when we have this lens that's on this placemat that you can see where we are in agreement. So this is something that we've come to where we are in agreement. And I think that it's going to be important to keep communicating however we're going to do it with this body and with your organization in relation to our advances and our conversations. So I'm looking forward to that as well. Not that it needs to be presentations, but any white papers that are interesting or that would fit, or things that are kind of going on with the current projects that we're doing, like our transportation system plan, our redevelopment plans, and all the areas that are ongoing. We have those things, we have city business that's happening. And so how can we capitalize on our priorities of being welcoming, inclusive, forward-thinking, resilient, climate friendly, someplace you can move around in traffic, obviously, and all the rest. And I just would hate to not mention that in a priority for me. Thanks.
Sure. And then on the social service item, we mentioned it earlier, the mental health response team. I tried to go after an earmark for that, and earmarks aren't allowed for operational things. But I'm assuming behavioral health is going to come back in 25. It's never gone away since I've been a mayor. There's always a discussion. And then if they do look at it, the ability that for cities to get, grant money or some kind of route of money from Salem to help, the police officers, we expand that. I know Beaverton wants to expand their bike patrol because, they're dealing with that. I know it's an LOC thing, but to have the specifics, I know you always ask us, give us the stories. So, work at helping us give you the story so we can get that sold in Salem. Councilor Hilliard.
Thank you. Counselor Brooks made me think of something. There's opportunities that we have when we're in different capacities that we may be meeting or just happenstance meet with other elected officials and be able to have a one-liner or a two-liner. So not a full white paper or something, but like if there's information and updates that are appropriate for the priorities that we're selecting, it would be great because people get around.
One thing I'll riff on that one is, when you have a moment, LLC does a great job of this. How do you effectively lobby another politician within a couple, 3 minutes? LLC teaches that before they send it to the Hill. So maybe it's something that if we do have to go to Salem, you prepare us, that you just don't walk in like a bumbling idiot. That we're prepared, we know, and we're bam, 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 we're hitting the points. I think that'd be a terrific thing to, help us out with.
Sounds like there is interest in lobbying 202 from this group at least. If it's all right, I think I'll keep us going on
Yep.
this. We've got another topic for
Yeah, But
discussion.
wrapping up, transportation, housing, top two. I think we all agreed on that.
Perfect. Okay. So that was that. So the next piece we'd like to talk about is our capital projects list. So I'll move to the next slide. It was on our theme slide. It came up through conversations with staff, but if you recall, it also came up with the city council when we talked about putting out the RFP for government services. That was one of the reasons the council was most interested in pursuing a lobbying firm. So at this point, what staff is thinking and would like to propose to the city council based on our conversations with Thorn Run, investigation into the various issues, is to focus the legislative agenda for next year on capital project asks specifically instead of policy asks. So the list here is project ideas on the state side. The next slide covers project ideas on the federal side. So there are a few reasons why these projects show up on the list. First, we were looking for projects within a specified dollar range, projects that would be palatable at the state level. Second, we were looking for projects that were ready to go or projects that could go to construction pretty immediately. You heard Dan talk a lot about asking for things that we're not ready to spend or asking for things after we've already spent it. So there's kind of this sweet spot that we were looking for projects. And then third, we were looking for projects that aligned with the themes that we just talked about, as well as the council's overall vision and priorities. So through that exercise, we identified 4 capital projects on the state side and at least 1 on the federal side for now. But we also identified a lot of projects that might be good candidates in future years. You also heard Dan talk about needing to plan 2, 3, 4 years out in advance. So projects that might come to your mind, certainly for me, as we went through this exercise, I had a lot of project ideas that weren't quite ready for next year, but maybe will be ready in 3 years. So you don't see that list in front of you. You just see the list for next year or the possible list for next year. So with that, I'll start by summarizing these projects. So first is seismic valving at 6 water reservoirs. So in the event of an earthquake, seismic valves capture the stored water in reservoirs and prevent it from leaking into the distribution system. So we're working on a project to build a new reservoir in town. That project will include seismic valving. So this funding ask is to retrofit our 6 existing water reservoirs. We estimate that the cost of all 6 is about $1.75 million. The second project on the list is the Veterans Plaza shade structure. So this will not shock anybody, but we are currently in construction to build the Veterans Plaza at the Lake of the Commons. One of the project elements that had to be cut from the design was a shade structure because of the cost of inflation. And so we have the design ready to go. The shade structure can be installed at any time. So the ask would be to add that back into the project. The third project is electric vehicle chargers. So this specific ask is more narrow than what you'll see on the federal side. It's just to install 119 charging ports on public properties like city services here, the library, many city parks throughout town. As you know, the Climate Action Plan saw that passenger vehicles were responsible for 74% of all local transportation emissions, and it indicated that widespread EV adoption was necessary to achieve the emissions reduction goal that we set. So electric vehicle chargers are a big import. And then the last project on this list for now is the Badge Access Program. So we've already begun work on this project. We've already purchased the software and begun installing it at a few different city facilities. The police department has it set up. We're getting it installed at city offices currently. So this funding ask would be to finish the project and install that system at all staff locations as well as 5 water quality facilities. It would increase safety for staff and critical infrastructure by having some identification and access other than the keys that we currently use. So I'll pause there before we move on to the state or the federal side, excuse me. I know Dan and Leah have prepared some comments on the strategy involved with these different asks, which might help fill in some of the gaps on why we landed here for now. I know one of the projects we're thinking of pulling for that second rung, but they'll go into more detail about that.
So one of the things to think through a little bit is pathways, and then I mentioned sort of earlier the zeitgeist of what you're looking at. There are really the main pathway to pursue funding is through the capital construction budget, which you'll often hear end of session budgets. You'll hear it called the Christmas tree budget. Essentially, the end of session where they will distribute to worthy projects the proceeds from a variety of different bonding sources, most notably the lottery bonding funding, but for certain, it may be GEO proceeds. You'll find some that it's a simple distribution of some general fund for some projects. And so there's a variety of sources that are at the end of session. And that is, I think, a competitive it will move back to a period of time where it's increasingly more difficult because the federal money is now out of the state budget or quickly out of that, which means there's a lot less funding to spend. So it becomes more competitive, more directed, but is something that they will put an end of session budget together in every single session. And so I often tell folks, it's they will spend the funding, and it doesn't mean they're going to spend it on your project, but they will spend it. And so having that conversation around what is your priority and how it fits into their priority is always a worthwhile endeavor. So on this project, the two that are in our estimation, those types of projects are the first two in that sense. And I think generally in terms of the types of project that gets funded, the first one feels more like a capital project. But I think in informing and educating and putting out there for potential funding the shade structure may make sense. The electric vehicle chargers is probably it's best thought of in the transportation context. And there's two different ways to think about that. And the mayor, you were talking about stories earlier. This is in one of these, it can be a story. So the transportation package, as you may have read, is really focused on maintenance, safety, and in finishing some projects that were committed in the 2017 bill, as well as a systemic hole in the ODOT budget. That's what in broad scale, that's what you will hear about the prioritization rather than new projects and additional spending. There will be a desire for an effort to make this as sort of environmentally friendly, carbon friendly or unfriendly, as it were, as they can for reasons related to policy and politics. There will be an effort. In 2017, the electric vehicle rebate was put in place. And so there is a history in this bill of dealing with electric vehicles as part of the transportation package. So it is conceivable that you could see some funding. There was a major discussion in 2017 and 2015 on whether to fund infrastructure, electric charging infrastructure as part of that package. You can conceive that may happen. If so, if they're going to do a funding package that is sort of a funding stream, having stories around what the city needs, even if they're not going to do a direct allocation, will still be important and sets you up well if you want to then go after that funding in some kind of stream. It's also conceivable that at the end of the day, they decide they do want to designate certain projects, and having a project like this ready as one of the projects that could be designated, that's ready to go, that fits within the themes of their thinking about. And so you hold this one as a potential either stream of funding or as a project funding for a transportation package that is still being put together, that doesn't feel like it's around projects, but that could change. And that has this element that in 2017, I think there will be some desire this time around, something on the environmental sort of carbon reduction efforts there. You could see something there. And so that feels like it fits within that that potential framework. Badge access is it's a bit more difficult of a project, just as you think about what is typically funded in the capital construction budget. One of the things that we've advised, which is this may be one that you hold there and wait for the right moment. In the last several cycles of the budget process, and this relates both to like strategic decision ahead of time, but also responding to a walkout. There has been efforts by the legislative leadership to put together packages that are themed around certain sets of investments, behavioral health, climate. We anticipate that one possible out there is a public safety or infrastructure resiliency package. This fits into that category, but I can't tell you with any kind of certainty today that it will be a viable solution in the session. So this is one that you could have ready if that conversation picks up, where all of a sudden you could have something that's either ready for a stream of funding that may be built, or particular project designations. And so that's one where you may want a layer that could fit within a theme that emerges either around infrastructure protection or on some level public safety. It's not we actually looked at this at some level on the federal side, and it doesn't necessarily fit the true public safety that they like to fund at the federal level in the same way, which is why we have it sort of in the state category. So that was sort of our quick take in responding to these projects.
Right, I'll pause here and see if there's any initial feedback on the state side before I proceed to the federal side.
Good question. So is this the exhaustive list that you put together? Is there anything like below this line that we don't see as far as that would be appropriate for this time frame that just didn't make this cut?
Sorry, I forgot to put my mic on. Sorry, Counselor Brooks. Not really. These were the ones that were most feasible given where they're at in the planning process. There were a few that felt closer than others, but nothing quite at this level. Yeah.
I just want to throw my 2 cents that, as important as the electric vehicle chargers are, that seismic valving, that's like Sherilyn's mentioned, our water's the big thing we provide to people. So to me, that's like stands above the rest.
Thanks for that feedback. Okay, we'll have a chance to chat more, but I'll move us along to the federal side now. The federal was a bit more challenging for us to put together, maybe because they're a bit more challenging. I don't know. I'll look to Dan to answer that one. So first on the list is electric vehicle chargers, similar to our state side. So we have already submitted a grant for electric vehicle charging. This is representative of our continuation of seeking that grant funding. So it's the city along with 17 of our neighboring jurisdictions, including just the teeny tiny town of Portland, are seeking funding for 1,000 charging ports that could be installed across Oregon's North Willamette Valley. About half of those charging ports would be installed at dense housing projects in publicly available lots. The second project on the list is railroad crossing. So I know at the least the mayor is informed. There is federal funding available in the form of a grant for railroad crossing projects, whether to take a look at the feasibility or plan for them or to actually construct them. We looked at this, and I know Mike and others have participated in at least 1 or 2 webinars, including one last week. And we believe that the intersection of Boones Ferry Road and Tualatin Sherwood Road is a good candidate for the project, but we're just not quite ready to complete the application. The application process itself for this grant, I believe, is like a 50+ page, and it's due in September. So our city engineer's suggestion is to do some initial feasibility work before looking at funding for a follow-up cycle. As we understand it, there is likely to be additional funding cycles for this grant program. So it's on the list on the slide, but probably not a good candidate for our list for next year. And then the last thing on the slide is a to be determined. So we are still looking to try to identify a good option for a congressionally directed spending requests. Thus far, nothing has kind of fit within the categories that they have available and is at that point in the planning process. So that's something that staff is still considering. And at the point that we do have something, which hopefully will be in the next few months, we'll come back to the city council for feedback on that before finalizing it. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan if there's any comments you want to share about this list of projects.
Megan, I think that actually covered it quite well. I suppose I'll take the moment because I know that I've explained our process on this. Those are two grant opportunities. There are many that come through, and I appreciated Councilor Brooks' comment about not chasing grants, because I think a lot of people get into that context. But there is we will be sending to the city team what amounts to about every 2 weeks. Sometimes it's more quickly, sometimes it's longer. The grants that have been most recently released that are available to local governments. And then with a doubling eye to, and this is one of the reasons we do a deep dive. This is one of the reasons we sit here, which is, you talked about this grant might actually work for the project that you were thinking about, with that eye for Tualatin. And so there's a systemic look at that. So there will be more that will emerge that the city may want to take a look at. I really would encourage the city, to the extent that we find a project that fits, to pursue a congressionally directed spending request. But again, you heard my caveat earlier. You have to finish on it, right? It has to be one that fits within that criteria that you can deliver on. Otherwise, you don't really get to ask again for a long time, and that's not the position you want to be in. So I'm excited the city will continue to be looking at different opportunities. It is hard. I gave you a bunch of criteria, and then what I didn't go through was, and it's a long memo that we've sent to Megan and Cody about, which is there are only certain accounts that you can earmark. And to the mayor's point about operations versus capital, and there's certainly certain types of things that you can fund it. So it is a bit of a jigsaw puzzle on finding what you have ready with what they're funding, and making sure you're not competing with other pieces. So it can be the hard work, and I'm excited about the ongoing process of having things in the ready. So when you're back a year from now, you know where you want to go and what directions you want to be. I think that'll be more positive.
Okay.
Councilor Brooks.
I just had a quick question. When we mentioned that these were the ones that were qualified from the list of grant, like federal grant opportunities, is there some information that we can get that can further explain kind of those buckets and what's happening currently in federal, so that we can think about this in a different way?
Absolutely.
In an educated way is what I mean.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last part, Councilor Brooks.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mentioned an educated way, not like a different way from what's being presented, but personally, an educated way, so that I can have more insight into when I'm thinking about things.
Absolutely. And we've put together a memo, for example, that talks about each of the different accounts that are available to be earmarked. Sometimes, and I'll say it is important. It would be good to read. It gives you the confines. I would say there's no absolute rules around it, but it is a very good marker of what will be successful, and it's worth evaluating.
Thank you. That would be great. And just because I said that thing about grant chasing, that just means kind of the beat and track, but I like being prepared for as many grants as we can get. So I don't want that to be confused at all. Thanks.
I'm just trying to understand this, like, to me, the railroad crossing, I understand we're not ready for it now, but is that something like we could work on and have ready to go? Because that's one where I think is a really unique Tualatin story, because that would make a huge difference in our community.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason to hold off on this one is that we're in the process of completing the transportation system plan, and that'll give us a better idea of what our transportation priorities are. And then with this initial feasibility study, I think our next ask, if it was a priority of the city council, would be to go for a full feasibility study for that grade crossing. One of the other components that may make our application more desirable is to do it as part of a group of cities looking at rail crossings, which would require a lot more connection. So I think that this is something that certainly with the transportation system plan and with the extra time, we'll be able to put together a better ask.
Because the example they gave when I attended a couple of seminars is one of the big deterrents besides the 50 pages is there's a significant city match. I mean, it's not small money, it's millions. And then the second thing is the way the cities are winning this is they're engaging companies like David Evan and Associates to do that evaluation of the crossing. So you have a packet of data that you submit of why this, this crossing needs to be fixed. That's what, I'd be interested in is more how we get that study funded that gives us the data to go with the federal government and figure out where we're going to get the match money from to get this done, because it's a perfect project. But like you said, we're not ready at all.
All right. So if there are any other questions or comments, ultimately, I'm looking for direction from the city council tonight on whether moving forward with a legislative agenda that includes capital project asks is the direction the council would like to go. And second, whether the projects listed here, even in their incomplete form thus far, are projects that you would like to be included on that list. Our plan is to come back to the city council at the end of August 26th, maybe. Second meeting in August with the final draft of the legislative agenda for the city council's adoption. So feedback taken tonight will be incorporated into that final draft that goes back before you at the end of August.
People okay with it? Thumbs up. Kristen? Yep.
So I guess my question is, I understand that we have an agreement with Thorn Run and how all that went through and works. I guess my question is, when we go after these funds, what is the cost of that? And I guess I know you don't have a crystal ball, but like, what are the chances of us getting these funds?
So I think a well-executed government relations plan focused on funding will return significant investment on return on your investment. Our collective, for example, in DC, if the magnitude is significant. To the point where you wouldn't ask the question because it's obvious if you've already been there, right? So it's hundreds of millions for a project. I mean, for example, if you were to land the railroad crossing project, that is significant money to do that project that is largely funded. That it would dwarf the cost associated with it if you're successful, and if you do it well, you have a good shot of getting it. One of the things I always, I think a collective look at what you ask for at the state and the federal level and the return on your investment on both the lobbying expenses associated both internally and externally will return. The individual cost of pursuing particular efforts, particularly big grants, that is really grant specific on how much that costs. So railroad crossing is a significant example of one that costs a fair amount, particularly if you want to do it well. That is also true on some of the water side. So WIFIA, which is a loan product, can also be quite expensive in terms of building the capacity to demonstrate your need for the loan product to do the water water infrastructure. But at the end of the day, the return on that is, millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, depending on the size of the project that you're working on. So it really is project specific. I think a robust government relations effort, particularly measured over time, any one particular year, you may not sort of win, as it were. But if you were to look at 5 years, for example, I think you will find a significant return on the investment. We'll always be honest with why we think things worked or didn't work. We will tell you when we think it was that we all sat around, developed the perfect strategy with great engagement by the delegation. And we'll tell you when it's like, sometimes that happens and it worked or didn't work. And we'll be really honest in that assessment as we're moving through it. But in my experience, people, communities that do this are extraordinarily happy that they did it over time.
So I look at Sherwood, the three cities, typical ones, Sherwood, Beaverton, and Tigard. The amount of money they pay for their lobbyists is the amount of money they get back is 100 times. It's just a phenomenal return. And it comes down to having a good plan from city council and from staff and having the right folks advocating for you.
Yeah, and I mean, and so I understand that, and I guess my question was more specific to like these projects for 2025, moving, like what are the likelihoods of these types of things going through was more of my question, because I mean, obviously we went through, you're here, I went through the application process with you. So just like, do we have the right set for us to say, okay, for this, for right now?
Okay, I was going to go in reverse order, but this is fine. So I think it is entirely reasonable, and you've got a couple of projects that I think can be compelling. And so I would say, I mean, I don't really get in the business of giving you percentages. I would say like, this is a good list to get one of them, right? And if there's a transportation package and they do something around climate reduction, having that transportation, there's 2 is not out of the question. But in that sense, so I think it is, these are, yeah, I mean, particularly the capital construction associated with seismic valving, that just feels like a capital construction project. What I can't caveat for you, and this is what's difficult, which is, as you may know, like the water infrastructure backlog in the state is enormous, and there's great interest in the legislature trying to figure out an investment package around that piece. So it's a matter of both the moment in time of whether that one stands up in a particular moment with the pieces. So it's in the right space. It's in a competitive space. And 1.75 is a fair amount. 250,000 is a much smaller amount. Probably on the edge of like anything below that, and I probably wouldn't ask type of amount. So it's that is eminently more doable. The other thing that I like about these, just to be particularly actually, I think all but perhaps the shade structure feel a bit more scalable, so that you're not saying, if I don't get 1.75, the million that you do have, I can't use, right? So it fits within that category. But if I were to so you have the luxury of having the Senate President as in your delegation, and he is very clear on the trade-offs that happen in the state budgeting that make it very difficult. And if you've been in there, and he's used the marbles, he's a great analogy with the marbles, which marbles do you want me to take from what bucket to fund that? And that is all very real. And as I mentioned, it's not clear yet how constrained the capital budget will be. The federal money has moved out. There was a proposal that was discussed recently, the governor's talking about in terms of reforming some of the education policies that will likely cost more. So you're seeing a constraint there. There is so there's a variety of things that will be a constraining of the budget. We haven't seen the economic forecast, so there is always that tension. But like I said, they're going to spend money. These projects are well qualified. You make the case, and whether you know, a lot of communities succeed. And I feel good about where we are on this. We haven't gotten into it, right? We're just at the brainstorming stage and setting the priorities, but these feel good to me.
Councilor Hilliard.
Thank you. I think these extra feel good because there's a diversity of cost and topic, I would say. But I just wanted to hear once again from staff. I know our city runs very lean, and I appreciate the effort that it takes to pull together a grant. So I'm kind of wondering what your role in grant prep might be and support, and then making an assumption that FTE will be tied into it to see out these projects so that the current budget isn't impacted negatively. So could you speak to that a little, please?
Sure. So most of these, for example, these probably won't have a grant process associated with them. There will be, but there will be some, right? So the funding will be sent to an agency. That agency is going to want to enter into an IGA with you. That all requires staff time. That's probably not something we're going to be involved in, other than helping facilitate if we get stuck. On the federal side, where we are, the current engagement would include, and Megan has sent some of these to us. One of the things that is good for us to do is to review the applications as they're going in to make sure that we're able to put our take on what they want to hear in light of what you want to do, and making sure those are married well. So we don't draft the grants applications. You'll need to either do that with a grant writer or yourself, but we can breathe into it. And the other thing that's really important is making sure that the delegation is well aware of the grants that you're submitting so they can weigh in, and we will do that work. There are some times when having agencies aren't super excited about hearing from members of Congress on particular grants. On almost all the cases, I say it's worth doing. So.
For instance, the electric vehicle charger, the CFI grant, which stands for Charging Fueling Infrastructure.
Clean Fuels Initiative.
Yeah. That one does include staffing. So we put that in there. It's like one FTE and maybe more. Mm-hmm.
President Pratt.
Right now, I think we get during the state legislative session, we get kind of your take on where bills are going forwarded to us. But with this process, how often will we at council be informed of what you're working on and what you see as prospects for these different items?
That leads really nicely into the last agenda item. Before we go there, I think I heard consensus that folks were comfortable with focusing on capital asks and the capital projects listed, with the understanding that we're coming back in August and may have a slightly updated list. Okay, cool. Moving on to communication and engagement. So I'm going to turn it back to Dan and Leah for this one, and then I'll close us out.
So in terms of communication and engagement protocols, our main points of contact are going to be Megan and Cody. So any important information should really be reported back to them. That way they can loop us into any conversations that you're having. So if you're having a meeting with a legislator, please let them know about that conversation so we're better informed when we meet with legislators in case those discussions come up. In the interim, we have a state update bi-weekly that we send out. We report on state news, so any ballot measures that are happening. Right now, we're really tracking elections. And then during session, We have a weekly individualized client report. So Dan will write up a comprehensive summary of all the things going on in the Capitol, so any rumors and gossip, themes and priorities that are going on, where we are on timeline and process. And then we will have a section of all the bills that were heard during that week with summaries on who testified, whether the bill died or moved, any amendments that emerged from that week too. And then we have another section that outlines all of the bills that are scheduled for the next week or any new bills that emerged. But on a day-to-day basis, Megan and Cody will receive multiple emails from us on committee notes or any updates that we have.
And in the context of the capital projects, those updates will have an overview of the work that has been done in the past week on the effort, as well as work that may be happening the next week. And so it looks, because the Ways and Means process is a process that doesn't have the same type of public deadlines and process, it can be a little bit more opaque in terms of the initiative and how you're doing that. So the description is not nearly as neat as there was a hearing, there was a bill, these people testified. That tends not to be the process in the Ways and Means, but we will give you a sense of the where we are in the process, where it sits within the budget context, where the focus is in terms of members, if we're getting feedback, stakeholders. So you will get some context on your specific asks in those weekly reports. But there are also weeks for which there's not much that is reportable in that regard because of just where the flow is on the Ways and Means process. I thought I might spend a little bit of time on your involvement. One of the it looks different in DC and than in Salem. Councilor Hillier, you mentioned, we may have conversations with people, and what does that look like? And so one of the things that I think is really important, which is the communication that Leah just alluded to, is if you have a conversation with a member, and I know it can be hard to remember, shooting Cody or Megan a note or and getting that information to us quickly so that the next day when we don't know that you had that and we're in that person's office and they're like, I was just talking with, we don't get caught off guard. Now we're pretty good at getting caught off guard, so they may not know that we caught off guard, but it would be better conversation if we knew, because it allows us then to leverage that well. So I would say that communication is really important. We are happy to work with you all on sort of what is a 3-minute elevator pitch on each of these. I will say, if you know you're going to be in a conversation, please reach out. We'll get you the background material on it. We'll let you know in April, this is what you should be saying, which may look different than in February. So if you're meeting someone in February, what I ask you to say to that person will probably be different than if you're in April. And so having that level of communication allows us to prep a little bit better. So we're happy to be a resource that's sort of a prophylactic how to help you and educate around some of that work. If you're going to be in Salem for other purposes and want to do some work around the city's agenda, if you want to contact Megan and Cody, we'll also be honest with you can if you want to make the connection, but at this moment, your input doesn't change where we are at this moment. If you had, and I won't make you feel bad. If you'd called me 2 weeks ago, this is what I would have had you say. Or if you're going to be here in 3 weeks, this is what I'd have you say. So we'll be honest. We don't think it's actually worth your time to do it. That's rarely the case. It is almost always worthwhile if you're going to be there. Same with Washington, DC. If you're going to go to Washington, DC, connect in and we might be able to use you if you have some time in that regard. The other piece, which is there are moments where, these members know us well. They respect us. They count on us to give them good and accurate information, but you also speak for your community. and you speak for their community. And there are moments will be important for you to sit in the room and say, this is important, and in a way that I can't, and Leah can't, or Tyler can't. And so there are moments when we will call upon you to do that. We will do everything we can to make sure that you are prepared, and we'll never put you in a situation where you can really screw it up. Go ahead.
Sorry, I should have clarified a little bit better my statement. I just want to be sure that we are speaking as one voice. And that is more my point of, because it is election season and, you know, people may inadvertently see people. I want to really be sure that we're speaking with unity is really why I was asking that question.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense. It's another reason to have a legislative agenda. If you can speak to the agenda, if that's where you want to focus, you will do a great amount of positive work on that.
Do you want, so I talked to staff too. So, you know, I've got to talk to,
Yes,
you know, Rearmitage and Mitra and
yes,
I talk to them all the time. So you'll probably be hearing from me a lot.
That's great. That's great.
Okay, all right. So it's staff and the actual
Yes.
elected.
Okay, so I think there were a couple points there. One, Thorn Run produces a weekly, sometimes bi-weekly email update. The council has the option to subscribe to that update. Cody and I are already receiving that. Is that something that the council would be interested in? Okay, I'm seeing a lot of emphatic nods. So we'll put you on that list so that you get those directly. In addition, as part of our contract with Thorn Run, I think we have scoped a pre-session and post-session debrief with the city council. And this is somewhat of our pre-session meeting to talk about our legislative agenda. So those are 2 additional times that you'll see their team before the city council. Then, of course, if there are issues that come up during the legislative session on the state side or throughout the year that we need feedback from the council on because they haven't been discussed already in the council setting or aren't on our legislative agenda, at that point, I foresee Cody and myself reaching out to get on the council's agenda to have that conversation or having conversations offline with individuals if needed to put together what our position is on that issue or not. With that, I think that there's also an opportunity for the council to have further dialogue on some of those communication protocols for things that happen offline. If that's of interest, Councilor Hillier, you mentioned that, but I'll leave that to you all to determine if that's a desired interest or not.
Megan,
Yeah,
if
go
I-
ahead.
in addition to the state, we also have a daily DC update that will, if you'd like to get a lot of email and don't mind a daily email, it's a very good update on what's going on in the Hill. Not, you won't find all of it relevant, but a lot of it is interesting. So let Megan or Cody know if you'd like to get a daily update on what's going on in DC, and we're happy to put you on that list as well.
That looks like a yes as well. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our presentation and prepared materials for tonight. Like I mentioned, we'll be back at the end of August with a final draft of the legislative agenda. But I'll pause here if there's any further items the council would like to discuss or questions you may have for Thorn Run's team.
Bridget has her hand up.
Councilor Brooks.
Thank you. Sometimes lost the screen. So I guess I still am feeling a little, there we go. My question is there a way that this ties in with our advance? I have that question. My other question is we are working through our climate action plan at this point. And I mean, we haven't seen the formal recommendations yet of the consulting firm that we utilized. And I think that information might be helpful and timely around some of these conversations. And I'm all for the capital projects, but there's something that feels like we haven't had conversation about this. Like it's kind of 3 projects and they kind of work on them, they kind of don't. And I don't even really know what the criteria is for these decisions. So I feel like I'm making decisions without a lot of information tonight. And I know we're just starting it off, but I just want to say that out loud because it feels, it doesn't feel right to me a little bit. Anyway, those are my questions around communications, especially from the perspective of policymaking.
Right. So we're gonna, the list is gonna come back in August, correct? Of the
Correct.
capital projects. So between now and then, maybe you could supply Council Brooks with some of the information she's looking for. And some background, or you work it into the packet for that night.
Yeah, we can certainly do that. To the question of, does it tie into the advance? I think that retrospectively, it certainly is tied into the advance in terms of the priorities. And I am confident that it will tie into the upcoming advance as well. Not that Thorn Run would be at the goal setting retreat, but this work will build on itself, and you will have more context at the next advance in January of 2025. And so I think you alluded to this, Councilor Brooks, but we are new at this. This is our first year, and we're a little bit putting changing the wheels while we're going down the freeway. And I acknowledge that it might not feel completely smooth, or some of these things are new to you, but we've come up with a good list, and I think we've got a great start, and we can give you more context for them. But it feels like we're toddling along the path, and we'll grow, and with the good work of Thorn Run. And I want to acknowledge the great work that Megan has and Cody have done. Megan in particular has just jumped in and spent a bunch of time kind of gearing up and getting us to this point. So anyway,
Yeah, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not trying to sound critical. I just, it just feels unusual. And that's just one. And then I don't want people to be at the advance, but I do think that we're talking about roadmaps and looking at things with different timing than we have in the past. And I think that somehow, when we're talking about council communications, just because it was on the slide, that would be something I would be interested in, is a pre-discussion, or is there time that, if we're going to be talking to an elected, for instance, we tell Cody and Megan, or we reach out to Thorn Run, so everything goes to Cody and Megan. I don't know, that just, some of that stuff just, I'm not sure about how all that works. Anyway, that's all I'm saying.
On that last point, Councilor Brooks, I can clarify. Yes, we are looking for that type of communication to go directly to Cody and myself, and then we'll pass that along to Thorn Run so that they can be in touch with specific guidance on those interactions. Yeah, the goal is to funnel contact to them through us too, so that they're not looking for emails from a wider number of people, so that they can pay a little bit better attention, knowing that it's coming from Cody and myself directly.
Yeah, we were very new at this process, so I guess from what Councilor Brooks is saying, one thing I'd like to maybe suggest thinking about is in future years, I mean, there's some great projects on that list, but in future years, like, if there's a process, if councilors have ideas of project, I mean, you've included like the railroad tracks and the charging stations, so that's great. But if councilors have suggestions how that can be communicated, like if we communicate to you, we would like that thought of, and then it can be brought to the full council, or just some kind of process for facilitating that.
I think that's it.
Right? Anything else? All right, I'll go ahead and close this work session and wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, Counselor Brooks.